So we're going to go ahead and talk about the Pythagorean theorem, which is something you should have learned in other classes, and if you don't remember, that's fine. That's why we're reviewing it today. So the Pythagorean theorem only works on right triangles, so it has to have a right angle in it. And it uses the hypotenuse, so this is C, the hypotenuse, and the two legs A and B. So the Pythagorean theorem works this way. You say the two legs squared, so a squared plus b squared has to equal the hypotenuse squared. And often I'll write it the other way, where I'll put the hypotenuse first, just because that's the one that's really, really important that you place in the right location. So another thing you need to know is when we talk about a Pythagorean triple, all that means is that all three numbers are integers, positive integers, and they work in the Pythagorean theorem. So if we end up with an answer that's an integer, then we can say that these are Pythagorean triples. So let's go ahead and do our first one. So first thing I always look for is the hypotenuse, or our C. So the hypotenuse is always across from the right angle. And so I'll square that first. So x squared is equal to, and then I add the other two squared numbers. So in order to solve this, I'm going to go ahead and just type in 81 squared plus 108 squared in my calculator. Oops, if I can type it in. All right, and I get 18,225. And then you take the square root of that, and the square root of, I need to clear my calculator. The square root of 18,225 is 135. So that's our x. So then it tells us to say if it's a Pythagorean triple. Well, since this is an integer, we would say yes. So there's no decimals. That's what I mean by integer, and so on. Let's go ahead and do our next problem. Same idea. So for this one, once again, I always look for the hypotenuse first. So the hypotenuse is always across from the right angle. So it's the 8. So we have 8 squared is equal to x squared plus 4 squared. So I just square the other two. It doesn't matter what order you write those in. This time, since the x isn't alone, I'm going to go ahead and find 8 squared first, which is 64. And then I'll find 4 squared, which is 16. And then we'll subtract 16 from both sides. And you end up with 48 equals x squared. And then you take the square root. Now, if you're using one of my calculators, when you take the square root of 48, you'll get 4. So x will be 4 square root of 3. If your calculator doesn't say that, that's okay. But if you're using my calculator, right above the enter button is a button that has like it's kind of like two arrows. You're going to hit that right after you type it in, and you'll get approximately 6.93. Let's go to the hundredths place since it didn't specify. Okay, let's just do another one to practice. So once again, first thing I always look for is the hypotenuse. So that's x in this case. And I start with the hypotenuse. So I have x squared equals 15 squared plus 20 squared. Since both squared terms are on the same side, I am going to go ahead and just type it all onto my calculator. So I have x squared equals 625. And then we'll take the square root of both sides. So the square root of 625 is 25. And I forgot on the last problem, it asks us to determine if it's a Pythagorean triple. For the last problem, number 2, the answer is no, since we have decimals. This one has no decimals, so the answer is yes.